She asked me a question, a simple one, and I just stopped talking. Not for a second, not for a minute, for the rest of the night. She kept asking what was wrong. I kept saying nothing, just that one word. We both knew it was a lie, but the strange part was, I wasn't trying to punish her. I genuinely couldn't find the words. It felt like reaching into an empty drawer, searching again and again, knowing exactly what I wanted to say, but somehow finding nothing I could actually pull out. If you've ever gone completely silent when something hurt you, and then hated yourself for it afterward, stay with me, because what happens in that moment is probably very different from the story you've been telling yourself. Let me take you back to that night. We were sitting in my car, parked outside her building. She said something that landed wrong. Nothing dramatic on paper, just one sentence, but my chest tightened immediately. My throat felt smaller, almost like it had closed. She asked, "Are you okay?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. It wasn't silence as a choice. It felt like silence as a wall. One I ran straight into. She took it as a rejection, and honestly, I understood why. From the outside, it looked exactly like someone shutting a door on purpose. But from the inside, it felt like someone had shut the door for me, and I was standing there just as confused as she was. I drove home that night convinced there was something wrong with me. Maybe I was cold. Maybe I was emotionally unavailable. Maybe I was avoidant. I didn't have a name for what had happened. I just had the aftermath, and a lot of guilt I didn't know where to put. Months later, I started looking into it, and what I found changed the way I understood that night completely. There is a response built into the nervous system that most people know far less about than fight or flight. It's called the freeze response. When emotional pain hits faster than you can process it, your nervous system doesn't always move toward fighting or escaping. Sometimes it slows everything down. It can make you feel stuck, disconnected from your words, unable to respond the way you normally would. And that matters, because when someone is standing in front of you saying, "Just talk to me," you might genuinely want to, you might desperately want to, but wanting to speak and being able to access the words in that exact moment are not always the same thing. That doesn't automatically mean you're stubborn. It doesn't automatically mean you don't care. Sometimes your system is simply overwhelmed. And there's another part of this story that goes even deeper. Nobody starts life believing that silence is safer. Watch a toddler when they're upset. They cry, they scream, they make the pain impossible to miss. They don't stop and think, maybe I should keep this emotion to myself so nobody gets uncomfortable. Something happens between that child and the adult who sits silently in a parked car. We learn. Maybe you grew up in a place where showing too much emotion made things worse. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe you tried to explain that something hurt, and the person you trusted dismissed it. Maybe you opened up once, and what you shared was later used against you. Or maybe nobody did anything dramatic at all. Maybe you simply learned, over thousands of small moments, that quiet pain was easier for everyone to handle than loud pain. So you adapted. You got quiet, not because you stopped feeling, because feeling out loud started costing you something. That lesson can become automatic, and years later, completely different people and completely different situations can trigger the same old response. That's why your silence can feel confusing even to you. You're not consciously deciding, "Today I'm going to shut everyone out." Your nervous system may simply be reaching for a strategy it learned a long time ago. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because from the outside, silence looks empty, but inside, it can be incredibly crowded. You may look completely still while your mind is running through everything. Did I overreact? Have I felt this before? What is this really about? What do I actually want to happen? If I speak right now, will I explain this clearly? Or will I say something I can't take back? That last question used to keep me quiet longer than anything else. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, because I was afraid of saying something true while I was still too overwhelmed to say it fairly. And that distinction matters. Sometimes silence is avoidance, but sometimes silence is processing. Those two things can look almost identical from the outside. They are not the same thing. There's a useful psychological idea called the window of tolerance. It describes the range in which we're regulated enough to think, communicate, and actually hear another person. When you're pushed outside that range, communication can become much harder. You might shut down, or you might go in the opposite direction and say things purely from the heat of the moment. Either way, the conversation stops being about understanding and starts becoming about surviving the emotion. That's why sometimes the most productive thing you can do is pause. Not forever, not as punishment, just long enough to come back to yourself. And this is where people often misunderstand the quiet person. They think, if you loved me, you would talk to me right now. But sometimes the quiet person is silent precisely because they care. Because they know what can happen when pain speaks before it has been understood. Because they know that one sentence said in anger can stay in another person's memory for years. So they wait, they hold it. They try to separate what they actually feel from what the pain is telling them to say. That doesn't make silence automatically healthy. And it definitely doesn't make disappearing for days, okay? There is an important difference between needing time to regulate and using silence to control someone. If your silence is meant to make someone panic, punish them, or gain power over them, that is something different. But if you're sitting there overwhelmed, wishing you could explain yourself, and simply unable to do it yet, that is a very different experience. And there's something you can do to make that difference visible. Because understanding yourself is only half the solution. You also need a bridge back to the person you're with. If you're the one who goes quiet, try replacing nothing with one honest sentence. Say, I need a little time before I can talk about this clearly. I'm not asking for space from you. I just need time. That sentence is powerful because it communicates something your silence cannot. It says, I'm still here. I still care. I'm not abandoning you. I just can't process this out loud yet. And if you're the person standing on the other side of that silence, there's something you can do too. Instead of repeating, just talk to me. Try. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That doesn't mean accepting endless silence. It doesn't mean ignoring your own feelings. It simply removes the pressure from the moment. And sometimes removing that pressure is exactly what allows the words to finally come. I tried this myself. The first time I said, I need time, not space, it felt awkward, almost rehearsed, but something changed. She didn't push, and I didn't disappear. 20 minutes later, I came back with something real to say. Not everything was fixed, but for the first time, the silence wasn't a wall between us. It was a pause we both understood. And there's another reason this matters. When someone doesn't speak until they've actually processed what they feel, the words that finally come can carry a different kind of weight. They're not just a reaction. They're closer to a conclusion. You've turned them over. You've checked them for fairness. You've separated what you actually mean from what you wanted to say in the heat of the moment. So when you finally say, this hurt me, you may have spent hours making sure you mean exactly that. Not more, not less. That kind of honesty takes longer to arrive. But when it arrives, it can be very real. Still, there is one thing I don't want you to take from this video. I don't want you to hear all of this and decide, good, my silence is always healthy. It isn't. Your nervous system may have learned silence for a reason, but a coping strategy can protect you and still eventually need to change. If you always disappear instead of communicating, people around you can get hurt too. If the silence lasts for days, if nothing ever gets discussed afterward, if you repeatedly leave people guessing what happened, then the pattern deserves attention. Understanding why you shut down is not an excuse to never come back. It's the beginning of learning how to come back differently. And maybe that's the real goal. Not becoming someone who never goes quiet. Not forcing yourself to talk before you're ready, but becoming someone who can say, I'm overwhelmed right now. I need a little time. And I promise I'll come back. Because healing doesn't always mean getting rid of the response. Sometimes it means giving yourself a better option. A bridge between silence and connection. So if you're the person who goes quiet when you're hurt, I want you to remember this. You are not automatically cold. You are not automatically manipulative. You are not broken because words disappear when emotions become too intense. You may simply have learned a very old way of protecting yourself. And if you're lucky enough to have someone who loves you through that silence, they deserve honesty too. Not mind reading, not endless waiting. Just one small signal that says, I'm still here. I just need time. Because the right person shouldn't have to guess whether your silence means goodbye. And you shouldn't have to force yourself to speak before you're ready just to prove that you care. Maybe one day, when you finally feel safe enough, you'll notice something changing. You'll start letting people in before you've figured out every single word. Not because your silence was wrong, but because you don't need it quite as much anymore. That isn't weakness, that's healing. And maybe the most important thing you can learn about your silence is this. It was never proof that you didn't feel enough. Sometimes it was proof that you felt so much. You needed a moment to find the words. If this felt like someone finally gave a name to something you've been carrying for a long time, subscribe. There are more parts of your mind waiting to be understood.